Welcome to Philosophy and Critical Thinking, the Basics. In our last video, we discussed conditionals. In this video, we're going to discuss arguments that involve the terms all, none, only, and some. These arguments are typically known as categorical syllogisms, and we're going to talk about how they operate in our arguments. Let's start with the word all. When we use the word all in arguments or in a premise in an argument, these premises are called universals. They're universals because what we're saying is all of a certain kind of thing will hold some kind of property. So, for instance, in our first argument here, all humans will eventually die. We're saying all things that are human will have the property of eventually dying. So this is a universal premise in this argument. And as we know from previous videos in these tutorials, saying all humans will eventually die and that I'm human, it would have to be the case that I'll eventually die, because all of those kinds of things that have that property, if it shows that you are that kind of thing, it also shows that you have that property. If we go back to our logical form, all A are B, A, therefore B. So all things that are A are also B. Since it's an A, it must also be B. So when we're dealing with universal premises, all we can say about the premise is that all of a particular kind of thing will hold some kind of particular property. In this case, all humans will eventually die. So as we can see with this argument, all humans will eventually die, I will eventually die, therefore I am human. As we've seen in previous tutorials, this is invalid due to just because all humans will eventually die, just knowing that I'll eventually die doesn't mean I am human. So you can tell that just because all of one particular kind of thing has that property, just because you happen to have that property, doesn't mean you happen to be that particular kind of thing. So when we see the logical form of this, all A are B, B therefore A, is the invalid treatment of a universal premise. So all we can say is if you are that kind of thing, you have that property, but just because you have that property doesn't mean you're that particular kind of thing. Moving on to the next form of premise in an argument called negations, which is no or none in an argument. Consider the premise here in this first argument. No humans will live forever. What's being said here is that there are no circumstances where one kind of thing will possess a particular property. So in this case, it's saying there are no humans, no kinds of things that are humans that will hold the property of living forever. So when you see the argument here, no humans will live forever. I will live forever, therefore I am not human. So we can see this is valid, because if it's the case that no humans will live forever and that I will live forever, it has to be the case that I'm not human. You can see the logical form down the bottom where it says no A are B, B, therefore not A. And this is a logical form of a negation, because we're saying that no particular kind of thing holds a certain property. So if it does happen that you hold this certain property, then it would have to be the case that you are not that particular kind of thing. Let's see where negations can go wrong. No humans will live forever. I will not live forever. Therefore, I am human. So when we look at the first premise and we know that what we're saying here is there is nothing which has the property of being human which will have the property of living forever. Just because I don't have that property, in this case I'll not live forever, doesn't mean that I'll be human. The counterexamples here are very similar to our previous tutorials regarding all humans eventually dying, is that I could be a plant or I could be an animal. So there's examples here where there'll be other things that will also not hold that property. But all that we can say about that first premise is that there are no humans that will hold the property of living forever. It's not saying that there are no other kinds of things that will also not have that property of not living forever. So when we look at the logical form of this style of argument, no A are B, not B, therefore A. And as we can see, this is an invalid treatment of a negation in a premise. Let's look at the next word, only. I've classified these former premises as constraints. This is my own term, not one used in basic philosophical literature. So if you're trying to find that, you won't, because it's my own use. But if you find other uses for this kind of premise, that's perfectly fine. Let's look at the argument here. Only trained astronauts can go into outer space. I am not a trained astronaut. Therefore, I cannot go into outer space. So this first premise, this constraint, is saying that only things with one kind of property can have this other kind of property. So the first property here would be being a trained astronaut, and the second property is being that you can go into outer space. So if it's the case that only trained astronauts can go into outer space, and if it's true that I am not a trained astronaut, I don't possess that property, then it would have to be the case that I cannot go into outer space. So we can look at this in logical form here as only A are B, not A, therefore not B. And this is a valid treatment of a constraint premise. So let's see how a constraint premise can go wrong in an argument. Only trained astronauts can go into outer space. I am a trained astronaut. Therefore, I can go into outer space. Now, if it's true that only trained astronauts can go into outer space, and I am a trained astronaut, is there a case where we can think where I can't go into outer space? There's plenty. I could be sick that day. I'm meant to go off to launch, or I may have been sacked. I might be still a trained astronaut, but no longer employed by NASA, and so on. The point here with this kind of invalid treatment of a constraint is that when we're saying that only particular kinds of things hold a certain property, we're not saying all of that kind of thing has that property. We're only saying that only those kind of things have the capacity to hold that property. So that's something to be very careful with when using the word only or using constraint premises. So this is an invalid argument, saying just because only one kind of thing can hold a property, just because you do happen to hold that first property doesn't necessarily mean you'll hold the second property. It's just saying only them can hold that property. So into logical form, only A are B, A, therefore B. So this is the invalid treatment of a constraint premise. So when we go into the last word used in some premises, some, just before we move on to that, we just need to make clear that the word some in philosophy can mean something slightly different to what we will mainly use the word some in common language. In common language, a lot of people use the word some to imply more than one, like a few, or like might use it as not all, like some but not all. That's not how we use it in philosophy. In philosophy, some means at least one. So it could be the case if you're saying that, say, all humans will eventually die, it would also be true that some humans will eventually die, because some means at least one. If it's true that all humans will eventually die, it's also true that at least one human will eventually die. So that's just something to be careful with when you're looking at the word some in philosophical literature, that some means at least one. So knowing that, looking at the argument here, Some dogs are vicious. Dogs are animals. Therefore, some animals are vicious. This is a valid argument, and we'll see why soon. So some, at least one, dogs, dogs or having the property of it being a dog, so at least one thing that has the property of being a dog has the property of being vicious. So that's what the existentials say. There's at least one dog out there that has the property of being vicious. Now, the second premise is that dogs are animals. So dogs that hold the also hold the property of being an animal. So this is a further property that dogs also possess. Therefore, some animals are vicious. So it's saying that if it's true that some dogs are vicious and that all dogs are animals, that would have to be the case that there are some animals that are vicious. Because if it's true that all dogs are vicious and all dogs are animals, it would have to be the case that there are some animals out there that are vicious. So we can watch this a bit carefully here in logical form. Some A are B, A are C, therefore some C are B. So going through its literal translation, there is at least one thing with a property A which also holds property B. Property A holds property C, so it would have to be the case that there are some things that hold property C that also hold property B. So that's how we can see how a existential argument can be valid by looking at the premise here. So let's see where an argument can go wrong with a existential premise. Some dogs are vicious. Therefore, some dogs are friendly. Now, if it's the case that there is at least one dog out there that is vicious, it doesn't necessarily mean the case that there is at least one dog out there that is friendly. One way it can be is that it could be true that all dogs are vicious. That could possibly be the case, because remembering some means at least one. Even if that's not the case, if you want to ignore that possibility, just because at least one dog is vicious, it doesn't mean that there might be a dog out there that's friendly. The other dogs might be, might not like humans and might be, run away every time it sees a human. But then it's still not vicious. So so this is a invalid treatment of the word some. Just because some dogs are vicious or some kind of thing holds a certain property, it doesn't mean that those kind of things hold some other property. To see this a bit more clearly, looking at logical form, some A are B, therefore some A are C. Just because we know that something with the property A holds property B, it gives us no reason to say that it holds some different property, which would be C. So yeah, this is an invalid treatment of a existential. Okay, so now that we've seen how these kind of premises used in an argument can be valid and invalid, let's see how we can check whether the premise is true, because obviously we need to see whether an argument sounds, not just that it's valid. Once again, similar to checking for validity when we use counterexamples, we can use counterexamples against the first three of these kind of premises. Take, for instance, the universal all or every. Sometimes you might not say all, they might say every, which is to imply the same thing. We can provide an example where that kind of thing doesn't possess that property. Say, for instance, going with all humans eventually dying, we could point out to an example, say, oh, here's this human that has lived forever or will live forever, and so on. Next one with negations, you can provide, or with the none or no, like for instance, no dogs are vicious, something like that. Example where that thing does possess that property. So if I was to say, oh, no dogs are vicious, we can say, well, there was that dog that bit that lady the other day, so that's a vicious dog. So here's an example of that. So that's how you can show how a negation can be false, by providing those examples, so that counterexample. Regarding constraints, the use of the word only, all you got to do there is show an example where other things also possess that property. Like, for instance, with the trained astronauts, only trained astronauts can go into outer space. You could say, oh, well, they brought a monkey into outer space, or, they had this person who won this special lottery, and they were able to go onto a trip with the astronauts into outer space, and they just did all the work for them. So even though they weren't a trained astronaut, they could go into outer space. So you're just showing that how other things can also possess the same properties. So that's how you can show a counterexample to how a constraint can be false. Existentials, some don't necessarily hold a counterexample per se. It's just you would have to show that none of those things actually do possess that property. So if you're saying at least one of these kind of things hold that property, you'd have to show them that there is none of those things that possess that property. For instance, if you're going to say that there are like with the some dogs are vicious, you could say, oh, well, none of them are vicious. So, every time there was the example, there was a dog bit someone, you could show, I can prove to you that, they were attacked or something like that. So with the existentials, you need to show that none of those things possess that property in order to reject the existential premise. If you want more information, you can go onto the website www.philosophycriticalthinking.com, and we go through these topics in a bit more detail. Or you can purchase the book Understanding Arguments by Walter Sinnott Armstrong and Robert Fogelin, which you can click onto in the description below if you want to purchase that. Our next video will be on uses of the words and or in premises. These are called conjunctions and disjunctions, and we'll be going through how they work in arguments. If you want to stay tuned for those further tutorials, please subscribe and click the bell. Thanks.